everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Courtney Shaw, and I'm the facilitator of our series. We do have a few more weeks going in the series. Next week, we're going to have speakers from the Kent Chamber of Commerce talk to us about implicit bias. But this week we have a new speaker. I'm very excited to bring somebody else into the Community Conversations fold. Anita Quirk studied religion and Spanish before going to law school. She then practiced law for 21 years before coming to LCC in 2011. She teaches criminal justice and business classes, as well as law and social issues. So please welcome Anita Quirk.
Thank you, Courtney. So hello, everyone. Today, we're going to take just a quick snapshot of racism in the criminal justice system. And the first thing I wanted to show you here is that racism is considered a public health issue. And you can see from one of the past presidents of the American Public Health Association that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities and unfairly advantages other individuals and communities. But the most important thing that I think we have to look at here is that it becomes a waste of human resources. So this is not just within the criminal justice system, but this is within any other kinds of systems where racism may become an issue. So to give you just a little bit of a background about the criminal justice system here in the United States, I can tell you that the United States is number one. But it's number one with the largest criminal justice system in the entire world. We convict and incarcerate people at a higher rate, almost double than any other country. So you can see this little chart here. United States is at the top. So in May of last year, at that time, per 100,000 people here in the United States, we had 655 actually in jails and prison. So also last year, at the time that this pie chart was done, it gives us a little bit of an idea of who is incarcerated, where, and for what. So you can see here this little pie shape right here. That's all of these over here. So juvenile justice system, territorial prisons, immigration. Involuntary commitments are those people who have been deemed, usually due to mental health issues, as a danger. But let me show you here on the pie chart itself. Notice federal prisons is pretty small. Now you have to remember when we're talking about punishing people for crimes, it has to do under or with those crimes within whatever system we are in. And here with federal prisons, this would have to do with federal statutes. Local jails, you'll notice some of these are not convicted. So these are people being held, they're waiting trial or for some other kinds of reasons. Some convicted, which means they've already been found guilty or they've pled guilty and they're in local jails. Now, jails have to do with the lower level crimes where punishment under the statute is going to be less than a year. But you'll notice the vast majority of people are within state prisons. These are for felonies. These are the kinds of crimes for which someone has been sentenced for a year or longer. Well, I can say that fortunately our prison populations have been decreasing some because of changes in laws, such as, for instance, decriminalizing marijuana and implementation of certain kinds of reforms, such as within our juvenile justice system. Unfortunately, we still have some other problems we have to address. And one of these problems is the disproportionate arrest, conviction, and imprisonment of people of color. Of course, these problems are historical here in the United States, but they are pervasive and ongoing. And this comes from an article from the Young Lawyers Group from the American Bar Association. So if at the end, if any of you would like to actually have a list of these sites, I would be very happy to see how we could get these to you if you'd like to look up this information more. So at the end of 2019, per 100,000 Black residents here in the United States, we had almost 1,100 who were actually sentenced Black prisoners. Per 100,000 Hispanic residents, we had 525 who were sentenced and serving time. And among white prisoners per 100,000 white residents, we had only 214. Now, of course, at this point, I could hear the wheels turning and saying, well, obviously, Black people commit more crimes. But notice here in 2019, across all ages, all offenses, we had a lot more white people arrested. Obviously, white people, at least being caught, are arrested more often than Black people. But this next piece gives us the real tell. So from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, Black people were overrepresented among people who were arrested. Okay, now we're looking at non-fatal violent crimes here, but it's relative to their representation in the US population, which is about 13%. Conversely, white people were underrepresented. White people not of Hispanic origin account for about 60% of the US population, but are actually arrested much less often. You'll notice also that Hispanics, regardless of their race, were also overrepresented. The big difference here has to do with 60% versus 13%. So why do we have this disparity? Well, let's take a look at a few things that we find from research. Let's look at drug law violations. Okay, notice that here, this is from a report to the United Nations on racial disparities by the Sentencing Project, that in 2015, drug use rates actually do not differ substantially by race and ethnicity, but yet 3.7 times of Black people are more likely to be arrested at that time for marijuana possession than whites. Notwithstanding, again, that the rates do not differ substantially. New York City had a policy, and you've probably heard of it, called stop and frisk. The problem that we have with stop and frisk is that it ended up broadly targeting male residents of neighborhoods populated by low-income persons of color. to try to uncover drugs and weapons. Well, it turned out that it actually was very ineffective. And it was very discriminatory because of who it actually targeted. Part of the problem with the stop and frisk idea was that racial profiling became an issue. Now, this, of course, refers to the discriminatory practice by law enforcement targeting individuals for suspicions of crimes. And with racial profiling, we are looking at an individual's race, ethnicity, sometimes religion or national origin. Now, criminal profiling in and of itself is not an issue, but when criminal profiling is actually targeting individuals of certain characteristics that they believe to be associated with crime, now we have the problem. This article written by David A. Harris in 2020. This is an article that you can find on the American Bar Association website. He stated, "We knew in 2000 and we know now that racial profiling does not make us safer." This was one of the underlying reasons for this. It makes us less safe. It misses intended targets. It ends up blinding law enforcement. And the biggest problem, it actually keeps police departments and communities of color at odds with each other. You've probably heard the phrase driving while Black. And for those of us who have never experienced this, we may not think it really exists. The problem is it really does exist. Black drivers tend to be stopped a lot more often in what we call proactive stops. In other words, these stops that are used to investigate drivers that are deemed suspicious. Okay, this is not the same as traffic safety stops. So, if somebody's tail light is out or they're speeding or something else of that nature. Nationwide surveys show that Black and Hispanic drivers are 3 times as likely as whites to be searched once they've been pulled over. And Blacks are twice as likely as whites to be arrested, even though police officers usually have a lower, what we call contraband hit, when they search Black versus white drivers. In fact, one of our current Republican US Senators, Tim Scott, who is a Black man, has admitted to being a victim of bigotry and has been pulled over by police 18 times. Now, I suppose we could say maybe he's a real rotten driver, but that's really not it. So this was reported in the National Review and was cited in the magazine The Week, actually for the issue dated for this week. So this is something that is not something in the past. This is something that still happens now. Okay, proactive policing. Now, there is nothing wrong with proactive policing. You notice, though, we do have a problem when the proactive policing has to do with pulling people over just because they are a person of color. But proactive policing in and of itself is for deterrence of crime. Usually this is by showing more police presence in the community This has to do with investigating, discovering offenses, conspiracies, those kinds of things to try to prevent crime from happening in the first place. Okay, that's not such a bad thing. But here's the problem. Usually, it turns out that non-whites have a very high rate of being stopped, questioned, cited, arrested, or even injured by police. Again, because we end up with racial profiling. Again, proactive policing in and of itself is a good idea. Now, the question is, though, how is it being used? If you take a look, and you can look up this book and you can actually read the chapters online, Proactive Policing, Effects on Crime in Communities, which comes out of the National Academy's press. This is a very, very telling chapter. Okay, so what is the problem? Is the problem with the law itself? Well, since the Emancipation Proclamation and other groundbreaking advances in the law, as well as the US Supreme Court decisions, fortunately, laws have continued to develop to provide more protection for people, for women, for persons of color, for all the different varying groups against whom we have seen discrimination. If we take a look at the criminal laws, so if you take a look at the statutes, whether federal statutes or state statutes that are part of our criminal laws, if you look at one of those, you will see they are not written to target certain people. We don't say, well, assault means this if you're a person of color, and it means this if you are white. And we will punish you this way if you're a person of color, and we will punish you this way if you're a white person. That's not how these work. If you read the laws, if a person, no matter who it is, does certain kinds of acts, we deem that a crime, and this is how you can be punished. Okay, so a criminal statute is not necessarily the problem here. But we do have a problem, and that has to do with the application of the law. Here in Washington State in 2018, because of the lopsided application of the death penalty, the Washington State Supreme Court found in the case of State v. Gregory that the Washington State death penalty is invalid because it's imposed in an arbitrary and racially biased manner. They didn't say that in and of itself, having the death penalty is unconstitutional. They said it's because it is applied in a racially or otherwise discriminatory manner. And that goes against the Washington State Constitution, against cruel punishment. At that time, we had 8 people sitting on death row. And because of this Washington State Supreme Court decision, those death penalties were commuted to life sentences. What's another problem? Well, implicit bias. Okay, so what is implicit bias? These are biases that we don't even realize we have. So for instance, here in Simply Psychology, it is possible to actually express explicitly the liking of a certain group or approval of certain actions, while simultaneously actually being biased against them. What's the problem with that? Well, we don't even realize that we have that. And so even if a person verbalizes approval of groups or actions, that person still could be biased against them. And I think in the future, we are actually going to have a wonderful presentation specifically on this. Okay, solutions. Oh, solutions, this is difficult. In our law and social issues class, our mantra is society is law and law is society. Society actually is the catalyst for the most part for changes in the law. How are we going to change some of the problems that we have when we see the application of the law, unless the nation's citizens, the individuals, and our societies do not make changes? This becomes more difficult where racism is openly espoused and demonstrated by individuals and hate groups. And it's insidious when there is still this quiet belief that others are inferior. Unfortunately, this all reflects in how we apply the laws, even though they may be colorblind on the surface. These are the problems that we have in that application. So our legislators can continue to legislate against hate and even make punishment more severe. But attitudes have to change first to actually see the change. Of course, one of the keys is education, but this isn't just education within a school setting. This has to do with self-education, making ourselves more aware of other peoples, of other groups, of setting ourselves that positive relationship that we can have with others. So basically, the solution starts with us, because it takes our society and it takes the individuals in it to make the change happen. So, can we have justice for all? I think so. But we need to change society first. So thank you very much. That's all I have for today.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to open it up to some questions. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, please feel free to put that in the Q&A tab there. So we have a question from Sean. Sean asks, how much more of an influence of the justice system has there been since the recent enactments of Jim Crow 2.0 laws in many local and state levels of government within the United States? And how much has this influenced other governments throughout the world in ways of operating or changing their judicial systems? That's the dog barking.
Well, actually, that's a great question, because that has become a very big issue. I'm expecting, though, that we will end up having constitutional challenges to some of these new laws that have been put in place within the various states. Because for some of those, we are looking specifically at a person's right to vote. once we go down that slippery slope of starting to take away rights, and you'll notice this is one of those little insidious things, because we also mix a little bit of truth with the goal that we want to get to. So they will say, well, you know, we want these laws in place because it is going to make the voting system better and tighter and have less fraud. Well, of course, we've noticed that there's very little fraud, if ever, within our voting system. And so that piece is a bit of a fallacy. In reality, the vast majority of these kinds of laws have to do with voter suppression. If we make it harder for certain groups of people to be able to vote, it could potentially sway an election. And of course, that's what this is all about. It's being able to sway an election so that we win. And so what if we just disenfranchised a lot of people? So what has this done, say, internationally? A lot of other countries have struggled with some of these things also. But I have to say, a lot of countries are actually quite dismayed by what has been happening in the United States. We're such a tremendous power, not just militarily, but economically. Although I think in some people's eyes, not as much as it used to be. But because we have this kind of power in the world, when things start going badly here in the United States, other countries become nervous. And well, they should. So I hope I've answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you. Your talk about fraud versus voter suppression. I kind of keep an eye on Texas because I lived there for a long time. I have family and friends, and they did the state did a voter fraud investigation and found that out of 17 million votes cast, there were 16 fraudulent ones, so less than 1 in 1 million. Therefore, they need to pass all these laws to make it incredibly hard to vote. And so, the balance of like, oh, we're doing it for fraud versus we're doing this for suppression, the numbers don't always add up there, is I guess what I'm saying there. Okay, we do have another question coming in as well. So this one is, we see an increase in homelessness, but working homeless become a #1 issue. Will profiling of the homeless become an issue similar to racial profiling in regards to arrests?
Short answer, yes, unfortunately. We do actually have laws against things like vagrancy, loitering, those kinds of things, which unfortunately actually end up criminalizing homelessness. So yeah, it's unfortunately short answer, yes. This has become such a problem here in the United States, and unfortunately the pandemic has just exacerbated the situation. We do not have good solutions in the vast majority of areas within the United States to take care of this. There have been some cities, there have actually been some private developers, other people and groups who have started to get a handle on this, but it takes some creativity. But yes, unfortunately, we actually do have laws on the books, not always enforced, but it does end up criminalizing homeless persons.
And just, from my background as a historian here, a lot of those vagrancy laws were passed right after emancipation of slavery, right? So this was targeted specifically at what they consider to be non-working people. And that could be, if a family decides that the husband is going to go out and work and the wife is going to stay home with the kids, she could be determined as a vagrant because she was not working for somebody. So these vagrancy laws, have a long and inglorious history. in our country here. And as far as the responses to homelessness with creativity, I think I read, and feel free anybody to add in the chat or something. I believe it was maybe Salt Lake City or one of the major cities in Utah that was coming up with new systems, and they decided that instead of using resources to police and punish homelessness, that they would use those same resources in order to develop housing and to funnel people towards those resources and social services, and it's dropped the homelessness rate tremendously. So that's something we see a lot of interest in right now, is sort of channeling policing from, or channeling like emergency services from policing to social services. So sending out, if somebody's having a mental health check, for instance, instead of having an armed policeman go investigate the situation, but to have a social worker do it. And is that something that can de-escalate how people are interacting with the criminal justice system?
That's one thing that we have within our criminal justice program, a specific class that has to do with crisis intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being taught by one of our counselors on campus. And it's specifically about de-escalating these kinds of situations,
Mm-hmm.
Understanding more about mental illness and being able to help de-escalate these situations before someone is harmed.
Good. Yeah, that sounds great. All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, oh, good. We do. I shouldn't cut us off. We have more. We have more. In regards to other countries with the rise of immigration, many of the usual democratic governments have elected more extreme right-wing parties, changing platforms almost to nationalism pre-World War II. Do we see that as an influence in criminal justice and the criminalization of immigration?
Yes, unfortunately, especially in some of the other countries. We do not see it quite as much here in the United States, at least not yet. Of course, we with the Democrats currently mostly in control, we're not going to see that as quickly. I'm afraid, though, if we make another shift to the right, we could very well see those same kinds of issues happen here in the United States. Immigration is it is a terrible problem, because so many people wanting to come here to the United States really don't necessarily want to leave their countries, but their countries are in such chaos and it is so dangerous for them to remain there that the United States, notwithstanding our problems, still looks like the best option. And until, and I don't know if it'll ever happen, but until so many of these other countries get a handle on their situations, I'm afraid we're going to continue to see this occur.
Yeah. That's a sobering thought. But yeah, there really does seem to be this global situation with scapegoating, minority communities, whether that be a religious minority or a racial minority. Certainly not just a U.S. problem. It's a global problem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I would love to be able to, if we're able to, I'd love to be able to put up the slides as well when we post the video, so that people can go and read more on your resources, since you were so kind as to provide lots of footnotes and details on where you're getting your materials from. That's very helpful for people who want to explore the issue more. Thank you for coming, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.